Hello, BRE-101 class. My name is Elvis Morani, and I'll be talking about Chapter 5, which is Selling, or How to Find the Right Buyers. This chapter goes into detail about how to fulfill those buyers' needs, how to pre-approve those buyers, what are pros and cons of owning a house, the different forms of communication in order to find said buyer, and what you should look for and provide for them in order to get these deals and correct buyers to you. So the first point I'm going to talk about is that when looking for the right buyer, you must fulfill the buyer's needs. And these needs can be split into 4 categories, such as the buyer's need for trust, information, advising, and financing. And I feel that if you fulfill each of those 4 categories, you have higher chance of securing the buyer's trust and finding the right buyer. However, you must also make sure that you pre-approve these buyers first before you try to help them find a home. And this can be put into 3 categories, which is financial ability, desire, and intent to buy, or as lenders like to call it, the 3 C's, which is character, capacity, and capital. And I feel it is important in order to not only fulfill your buyer's needs, but also pre-approve them, as if you don't pre-approve them, the deal could go south and you may potentially have found the wrong buyer. It is also important to know that when trying to pre-approve them, you make sure that the housing payments do not exceed 25 or 30% of their gross monthly income. And if they're in debt, make sure it does not go over the range of 33 to 38% when trying to pre-approve them, as that would also be a red flag. So my first point when going into this is that while it is important in order to fulfill your buyer's needs, you must also pre-approve them. And I feel that that's an integral part of finding the right buyer. And I feel it is important for us to remember these tips, as we don't want to be stuck with a buyer who's either unmotivated to sell or simply cannot do so in the first place. That was the first, and I believe, important point. The second point is that I want to go over the pros and cons of owning a house. Now, for the pros of owning a house include appreciation, getting tax benefits, equity buildup, and cash flow. One example of this, which I feel is good, is that we have the auxiliary dwelling units, or the ADUs, to help solve California's housing crisis. And I feel this is a pro if you own one of these units. Even if it can't be sold separately, it also increases the monthly income and cash flow, which I feel is a pro itself. However, there are also some cons to owning a household. And those cons can be functional obsolescence, when pretty much there is a factor that decreases the value of said household. And I feel that this, for instance, can be like an elevator in an apartment complex that stopped working. That can decrease the value of the household, and the seller is usually requested from the buyer in order to make those repairs, usually. As I forgot to mention that in order to pre-approve, you should always, and it's always recommended, to have a professional inspection or a waiver in the contract where basically allows the buyer to request the seller, which they get a copy of, to make all necessary repairs. And if you don't, the contract is rescinded and the deal is not done. And that's kind of a bad con when basically trying to buy the house, is that while it is curable, it is prone to happen. But there's also another term called economical obsolescence. And these are the factors that are incurable and increase the house's value over time due to economic situations or overall rest. Well, those are the pros and cons of owning a house. While it is good to own a house, like such an increase of value over time, and that you do get some tax benefits for single and married houses, and if you sell it over time. However, there's also some cons you should also look out for. And my third and last point is that when trying to find these buyers, you must know each form's communication. The book mentions, and I agree with for this last point, is that the buyer and seller, or in this case, when you're trying to find a buyer, they should have face-to-face communication when trying to find them, as it is the most effective way and it's the most direct way in order to get info. However, if you can't do face-to-face, there's also a chance of calling, but you should have like a call log in order to keep track of all the leads and potential buyers you may have. And it also goes into the least effective way, in my opinion also, is letters. But if you do write letters, it's okay. Just make sure that you answer and get the most information out of them possible. And you get their attention, interest, desire, and action, or the acronym ADA, when trying to get that buyer. I personally agree that face-to-face is the most effective way, as my father has clearly demonstrated and shown when talking with a potential buyer, it's the most easiest to get to know the buyer, get to know the character, as lenders like to say, and get potential information, like the phone call. And that's what I agree with. But when writing a letter, try to get a postcard and try to get that information. And if you're on a phone call with that potential buyer, try to refer them, if you have no choice, to another broker. And if you do, I believe you get 25% of their commission. All these points are really helpful in order to try to find that buyer. And those 3 points of finding and fulfilling the buyer's needs, pre-approving them for the first point, is important in trying to find said buyer. Knowing the pros and cons of buying and owning a house is also beneficial for us when keeping in mind about trying to help them find a home. And lastly, knowing the different forms of communication. And on a last note, referring to your third point, the closing deal is pretty much towards the end when you basically see that the buyer has an offer to give you. And this is the most, in my opinion, stressful part, as my father is always stressed about doing this and has given me scripts in order to be professional and honest as possible. There are differing methods, but I feel by finding the best one for you and knowing what you say and how to answer your questions, you will get that deal. Well, class, that's all I've learned from this chapter, and will greatly help me when I become a broker in the future. Chapter 5 was about selling, finding the right buyer, and I enjoyed reading that chapter. Thank you, class.